Okay, we spent this entire chapter talking about factoring techniques. So now we're going to talk about one of the many ways we use factoring. Okay, solving quadratic equations. And in order to use factoring to solve quadratic equations, we make use of something called the zero factor property, which says if you have two numbers and they're multiplied together that equal 0, the only way that can happen is if one of them is 0. It doesn't work for any other number other than 0. Okay, think about that. Two numbers that multiply together that equal 0. The only way you can get a 0 is if one of those numbers is 0. If I have two numbers multiplied together that equal 3, it does not mean one of those numbers is 3. I could have -1 times -3, and that's 3. I could have 1/2 times 6, and that's 3. I could have 1/3 times 9, and that's 3, right? It only works with 0. So first step, I've got to make sure, first of all, that I have an equation, that I'm actually solving an equation and not just factoring, okay? A lot of people make that mistake once they realize, oh, here's a purpose of factoring. They throw an equal sign in there. If I just have two factors, I'm done. Be careful. Make sure you have an equal sign and that you're actually solving an equation. Okay, so let's look at some. Oh, okay, I have an equal sign here and it's set equal to 0. Hey, it's already factored up for me. Okay, so that means if I have these two things multiplied together and equal 0, the only way that can happen is if at least one of those things is 0. So either this one is 0 or this one is 0. Okay, but now that gives me two simple linear equations that I can solve. Remember how we solve a linear equation? We just put all our numbers on the other side, variables on one side. So let's add 3 to both sides here. Okay, so that's gone. So 2y plus 0 is 2y. 0 plus 3 is 3. Since I'm multiplying by 2, to get rid of that 2, I'm going to divide by 2. Have to do the same thing to both sides, remember. Now 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I wind up with 1y equals 3/2. Same thing over here. Now I solve this. I'm going to subtract 1 to get this y all by itself. Y plus 0 is y, and 0 minus 1 is -1. So here's my solution, and we usually write them in brackets. So 3/2 and -1 are my two answers. Okay. So this one, if it's quadratic, right, if we had a linear equation, if that was just x minus 3x equals 4, here's the reason why we even need to do this. Right, I would combine these together. X minus 3x is -2x, right? And then get the variable all by itself on one side and then the number all by itself on the other. But if I have a square and a linear, I can't add them together. They're not like terms. I can't get a variable all by itself. Right? This is as close as you could get. You could put the number over there, but I can't go any farther. So I need a different method. That's why we use factoring. If I'm going to factor, it's got to be set equal 0. Do not forget that important step. It's got to be set equal to 0. So my first step is to subtract 4 from both sides, so that it equals 0. Your equation has to equal 0, and it has to be an actual equation. All right, so now let's try to factor this thing. I need two numbers because it's a trinomial that multiply together and equal 1 times -4 and add to give -3. Hopefully we're good enough at this that we don't always have to go over here and make our table, but if we do, that's fine, right? Two numbers that multiply and give -4 and add to give -3, right? One of them's got to be negative, so let's say 1 and -4 because that is -3 when I add them. So a +1 and a -4. Now that I have two things multiplied together that equal 0, the only way that can happen is if one of them's 0. So either x plus 1 is 0 or x minus 4 is 0. One of those at least has to be 0. So then we can solve the simple linear equation. So x equals -1 or x equals 4. So there's our answer, -1 and 4. Notice we got two answers, and on every quadratic, we better get two answers. When we had a linear equation, we just got one. If our biggest exponent was a 1, we would get one answer. On a quadratic, we will get two answers. So if you don't come up with two answers, you've also got some kind of problem. Okay, it's a quadratic equation again. I got to pay attention to that. It's quadratic. That means first step is it's got to equal 0. And it needs to be in descending order. So I'm going to add 16x to both sides. Okay, so that'll give me 2x squared plus 16x plus 30 equals 0. And now I try to factor it. My first step in factoring this is factor out of 2, right? So then that'll leave me x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 0. So I'm looking for two numbers that when I multiply them together give me 15 times 1. And when I add them together give me 8. How about 3 and 5? Okay, so x plus 3, x plus 5, and because that leading coefficient is a 1, if I divide by 1, it doesn't change these numbers. Okay, now think about this. If I have, this time I have three things multiplied together that equal 0. If I have things multiplied together that equal 0, at least one of them has to be 0. So either 2 has to be 0, x plus 3 has to be 0, or x plus 5 has to be 0. But 2 is not 0. This is not the one that is 0. This is 2. Okay, if I subtract 3 from both sides though, then x could be -3 would make this 0. And subtract 5. So x equals -5. So my two answers, not three answers, my two answers are -3 and -5. Okay, it's quadratic again, right? I have an x squared. So it's got to be set equal to 0. It has got to be set equal to 0. So let's subtract 4x from both sides to make it equal 0. Okay, this is not a trinomial. I'm not looking for two numbers. Okay, it has a common factor of x. And now it's completely factored. So if two things multiply together and equal 0, then either the x is 0 or the x minus 2 is 0. This one's already solved for x. So I know, oh, okay, one of my possibilities is 0 then. This one If I add 2 to both sides, I get x equals 2. So there's my other possibility. Okay, now they've got this one factored out for you, but because it doesn't equal 0, that's not useful. It's actually just more work. So I got to multiply this out and make it 0 and refactor it when it equals 0. So 2y squared plus 5y, 2y squared plus 5y minus 42 equals 0. Okay, so we need to find two numbers that multiply to give negative 84 and add to give 5. Okay, if it's going to be negative, one of my numbers has to be negative. So let's just start and go down the list, because offhand, I don't know, 84 is not our standard product. So let's just, and it's not too big, so let's go down the list. Negative 1 and 84. Negative 2 and 42. 8 and 4 is 12, so it is divisible by 3. Negative 3, and if you have to go over and see what it is, that's fine. 84 divided by 3 is 28. Okay, 28 minus 3 is not 5. So negative 4 and 21. 5 doesn't go into there. Negative 6 and 14. Not 5, but I'm getting closer. I'm getting closer. What about negative 7 and 12? Oh, yes. Okay. All right. So I can put a minus 7 and a plus 12. But don't forget, now on this one, my leading coefficient is not 1, so I've got to come back and divide this by that coefficient, right? Just using our shortcut. This won't simplify, but 12 divided by 2 is 6. So I wind up with 2y minus 7 and y plus 6 equals 0. If I have two things multiplied together that equal 0, one of them 0. So either 2y minus 7 equals 0 or y plus 6 equals 0. All right, so let's add 7 to both sides here. So we get 2y equals 7 and divide by 2. So y equals 7/2 is one of my answers. Okay, if I subtract 6, y equals negative 6 is my other answer. So here's my answer. 7/2, 3.5, or negative 6. It's just always exactly the same step. Okay, it's got to be set equal to 0. So if I add 16x to both sides, hey, look at this one. I noticed this is something squared. This is something squared. Is the middle 2 times 8x? Yes, it's a perfect square trinomial. It uses this, and this sign, all squared. Well, remember what that means. That is x plus 8 times x plus 8. Okay, so if I have two things multiplied together that equal 0, one of them is 0. Either x plus 8 is 0 or x plus 8 is 0. So x is negative 8, or x is negative 8. So notice, I still get two answers. They're the same number, but I've got two of them. All right, let's do one more problem. Okay, whoops, this is not a quadratic, right? But anytime your exponent's bigger than 1, we're going to set it to 0 and try to factor it. Notice I can factor a 3a out of both of those terms. So that's going to leave a squared minus 16 equals 0. And hey, this is the difference of squares, because this is a squared and this is 4 squared, and there's a minus. Okay, so 3a, and I got an a and a 4 that goes into each of my two terms. One gets a plus, one gets a minus. If you have things multiplied together that equal 0, the only way that can happen is if one of them's 0. So either 3 is 0, or a is 0, or a plus 4 is 0, or a minus 4 is 0. Well, 3 is not 0, right? That's not the one. Oh, but there, a is 0 is 1. Notice this time I'm going to have 3 answers. Okay, let's solve this. So a equals negative 4 is another one. If I add 4 to both sides, then I have a equals positive 4. Right? 1, 2, 3 answers. Okay, 0, 4, negative 4. All right. So on this last slide, there's the steps. If you want to pause this and write those steps down of what we were just doing. Every time you solve a quadratic equation, it's the exact same steps. First of all, you got to make it equal to 0, right? It's got to be in standard form equaling 0. Then you factor it. You use the 0 factor property to set each factor to 0. Solve those equations, and you can always check your answers. We actually was a little bit remiss. We didn't check our answers in any of these, but you just plug it back into the original equation. All right, guys, that's our very last video of the semester. Let me know if you need anything at all.